He struck her across the face so hard she hit the marble floor before she even had time to scream. His ring caught her cheekbone. She tasted blood. And in that moment, with her hands pressed to her swollen belly, 29-year-old Kate Sterling looked up at the man she had married and felt something inside her finally completely break. Not her spirit, not her will, something far more dangerous. Her patience. Because what Richard Sterling did not know, what no one in Greenwich, Connecticut had ever bothered to find out, was exactly who Kate's father was. And tonight, that man was on his way. Before we go any further, if this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Kate's story all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. The rain had been falling since 4 o'clock that afternoon, the kind of cold, steady Connecticut rain that came in sideways and turned the long private driveway of the Sterling estate into a river of black water. The iron gate at the entrance stood 14 feet tall. The security cameras mounted along the stone wall blinked red every few seconds, their little lights disappearing into the downpour. From the outside, the mansion looked exactly like what it was, the home of a man who had spent 30 years making sure the entire world knew how much money he had. Inside, Kate Sterling stood at the kitchen island with both hands wrapped around a mug of chamomile tea she had not touched in 20 minutes. She was listening, not to the rain, not to the low hum of the heating system or the distant sound of the television she had left on in the sitting room for company. She was listening for tires on the driveway. She was listening for the particular sound of Richard's car, the heavy thud of the door, the sharp click of his shoes on the front steps. Sounds that had come to mean something very specific to her over the last 3 years. Sounds that told her to brace herself. She set the mug down and pressed one hand flat against her abdomen. 7 months. She whispered it sometimes like a prayer. 7 months. The baby moved, a slow rolling sensation beneath her ribs. And Kate exhaled through her nose, slow and careful, the way the therapist she had secretly seen for exactly 2 sessions had told her to breathe when she felt the anxiety rising. She had stopped going to the therapist after the 2nd session. Richard had found the receipt. The headlights swept across the kitchen window at 9:47. Kate heard the engine cut. She heard the car door. She heard his shoes. She picked up the mug and carried it to the sink and stood there with her back to the door because she had learned in 3 years that it was better not to appear to be waiting. Appearing to wait irritated him. Appearing not to care irritated him. There was no version of her posture, her expression, her tone of voice that had proven to be reliably safe. But she had learned which things were more dangerous than others. And she worked within those boundaries, the way a person learns to live in a house with a broken step. Carefully, always, without ever forgetting it was there. The front door opened. She heard him pull it hard. He always pulled it too hard, and the sound bounced off the marble entryway. She heard him drop his keys on the console table. She heard him exhale. She turned around. Richard Sterling was 54 years old and had been considered handsome for most of them. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver hair that he kept perfectly cut and blue eyes that could, in the right light, look almost kind. He was wearing his charcoal suit, the one he wore when he had meetings in the city, and it was soaked through at the shoulders. His face was rigid in a way she recognized immediately, a kind of controlled fury that lived just beneath the surface of his expression, like pressure building under ice. He looked at her and said nothing. "There's soup on the stove," Kate said. Her voice was steady. She had become very good at keeping her voice steady. "And I made the bread you like. It's still warm." Richard walked past her without acknowledging the soup or the bread or her voice. He went to the liquor cabinet in the corner of the kitchen and poured 2 inches of whiskey into a glass and drank half of it before he set it down. Kate waited. "Hennessy pulled out," he said. She knew better than to ask what that meant. She knew what Hennessy was, a development deal, something enormous, something he had spent the better part of a year building toward. She had heard the name in phone calls she was not supposed to overhear, in conversations that stopped the moment she walked into a room. "I'm sorry," she said. "Are you?" It wasn't a question. He picked up the glass and drank the rest of the whiskey. "You're sorry. That's very helpful, Kate. Thank you. Is there anything I can do?" He laughed. It was not a warm sound. "What could you possibly do? What exactly do you bring to any of this that would be remotely useful?" He set the glass down on the counter, not gently. "I've been carrying this household, this marriage, every single thing for 3 years. And the one time I need things to go right, I come home to you standing in my kitchen looking at me like a frightened animal." Kate kept her hands at her sides. "I'm not frightened." "You should be," he said, and walked toward her. There it was. The thing she had learned to watch for, the shift from control to something else. It happened fast when it happened, faster than people who had never experienced it would believe. One moment he was pouring whiskey, the next moment the distance between them was 3 feet, then 2, and his energy was entirely different. Charged, dangerous, the way the air changes before lightning. "Richard." Her voice dropped not from fear, but from instinct. "Richard, stop." "Stop what?" "I'm standing in my own kitchen, in my own house." He was close enough now that she could smell the whiskey and beneath it something else. The particular sourness of a man who had been stewing in his own anger for hours. "You want to tell me to stop?" Who are you, Kate? What exactly are you without me? Please don't do this tonight." "Don't do what?" "Talk, have a conversation with my wife." His hand moved up and gripped her by the upper arm. Not hard enough to leave marks. He was still practiced enough for that, but hard enough to hold her in place. "I need you to understand what you've cost me. The lawyers, the delays, the way you've been. God, you've been a liability since the day I married you. You're hurting me." Quiet. Precise. His grip tightened. "I'm talking to you. The baby." She said it deliberately. She had learned that saying it could sometimes work. "Richard, you're going to hurt the baby." Something moved across his face. Something complicated. For a moment, she thought it was going to work. Thought she saw the pressure drop, the ice hold. And then his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, and he glanced down at it. And whatever he saw on that screen took the last of whatever restraint he'd been maintaining and destroyed it completely. He shoved her, both hands to her shoulders. She stumbled backward and caught the edge of the counter with the back of her arm. And that was when he hit her, open-palmed across the right side of her face, hard enough to snap her head to the side and hard enough for her vision to white out for a full second. And then she was going down, her knees hitting the marble, her hands out in front of her trying to catch herself. She heard herself make a sound she did not recognize. Heard him say something. Heard her own heartbeat loud in her ears. She was on her knees on the kitchen floor with one hand pressed to the side of her face and the other pressed flat against her belly, and she was shaking. Not from weakness, she realized, not exactly from fear, but from something physical, something her body was doing on its own in response to the impact, and she could taste the copper of blood where her teeth had caught the inside of her cheek. "Get up," Richard said. His voice had gone cold. When it went cold, it was in some ways worse than when it was hot. "Get up off the floor. You look ridiculous." Kate looked up at him. She had looked up at him from the floor before. Twice before tonight, if she was keeping count, which she was, which she always had been, and each of those times, something in her had scrambled to find a way to make herself smaller, quieter, easier to manage, a way to disappear into whatever version of herself would make him least likely to continue. This time was different. She did not know what showed on her face in that moment. But Richard took a half step back. She got up slowly, used the counter, stood with her weight distributed carefully, and her hand still pressed to her cheek, and looked at her husband without blinking. "I'm going upstairs," she said. "We're not done talking." "I'm going upstairs," she said again. Same tone, same volume. And something in the repetition, in the absolute evenness of it, made him say nothing. She walked past him through the kitchen, through the hallway, up the curved staircase to the second floor. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire way. She did not look back. She walked into the master bedroom and closed the door and stood in the dark for 30 seconds with her forehead resting against the wood of the door and her breathing slowly, carefully coming back under control. Then she crossed the room, sat on the edge of the bed, opened the drawer of the nightstand, and reached past the chapstick and the book she'd been attempting to read for 6 months and the half-empty blister pack of antacids and found what she was looking for. A phone. Not her phone. Not the phone Richard paid for. The phone he had full access to, the phone he checked when he thought she was asleep. This was a different phone, a cheap prepaid thing she had purchased herself with cash at a gas station in Stamford 3 months ago and that she had been carrying in her bag and transferring to the nightstand drawer every night before he came home. She had bought it for an emergency. She turned it on. The screen lit up the dark. 3 months of sitting in that drawer and it still had 40% battery. She stared at it. Her cheek was beginning to swell. She could feel it, the particular heat and pressure of a bruise forming beneath the skin. Her hands were still trembling slightly, though she pressed them together to make them stop. There was one contact saved in the phone. Just one, no name, only a number, international prefix, a sequence she had memorized at an age when most children were memorizing multiplication tables. She had told herself she would never use it. She had meant it when she said it to herself. She had understood, even when she bought the phone, even when she programmed the number in with shaking hands in the parking lot of that gas station, that using it would change everything, would pull down walls that could not be rebuilt, would start something she could not stop. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark with her hand pressed to her swelling cheek and her unborn child moving slowly beneath her ribs, and she thought about those walls, thought about what was on the other side of them, thought about who she had been before she became Mrs. Richard Sterling and who that person would say to do right now. She pressed call. It rang twice. Katya. The voice on the other end was low and accented and entirely calm in the way that very dangerous men are entirely calm because they have never had a reason to be otherwise. A voice that had not changed in the 10 years since she had last heard it. "Papa," she said in English, and then without meaning to, she switched. The language of her childhood came back the way it always did when she was afraid, not asking permission, simply arriving. She said 4 sentences in Russian, clear, specific, what had happened, what she needed. There was a silence on the other end that lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Where is he now?" her father asked. "Downstairs." "Is the gate code still the same one you sent?" She had sent it 3 months ago. Same day she bought the phone. Just in case, she had told herself. Just in case. "Yes," she said. "Go to the East Wing." Her father said, "The room at the end of the hall. Stay there. Do not open the door for anyone who does not say the name." "What name?" "Sunrise." He said, "You remember." She did remember. She was 7 years old when she learned it. The protocol word. The word that meant the family was coming and you were safe. "How long?" she asked. "We are already in Connecticut," her father said. The line went dead. Kate sat with the phone in her lap and her eyes closed and breathed. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The baby turned again. A slow somersault. She felt all the way up into her ribs and she pressed her palm flat against the movement and said quietly in Russian the same thing her mother used to say to her. "We are all right. We are going to be all right now." She stood up, crossed to the window, and looked out at the rain. For a moment, she saw nothing but her own reflection, the swollen cheek, the dark eyes, the nightgown that had become her uniform for evenings in this house. Then she looked past her reflection to the gate at the end of the driveway. She could just make out the red blink of the security light. She watched it for a moment. Then she turned away from the window and walked out of the bedroom and down the hall to the east wing. Downstairs, Richard had poured himself a third whiskey and was sitting in his study with his phone pressed to his ear, working through his list of people to blame for the Hennessy deal. His lawyer was number 1. His project manager was number 2. He had not yet arrived at himself on that list and likely would not. He was the kind of man who built his sense of self so completely on the architecture of his own success that any failure was by structural necessity someone else's fault. "I need you to call Franklin," he was saying first thing in the morning. "Tell him I want a meeting. Not a phone call, a meeting in person. Tell him." He stopped. He had heard something. Not inside the house, outside, a sound that did not belong. He went to the window of the study and looked out, and for a moment the rain was too heavy, the darkness too complete, and he could not see anything past the reflection of the room behind him. Then the security light at the gate went dark, just went out completely. Richard frowned. He pressed his face closer to the glass. In the driveway, something was moving, long and dark and slow. Then more than one something. He counted 1, 2, 3, and by the time he got to 4, he had pulled the phone away from his ear and was staring with the particular expression of a man whose brain is receiving information it doesn't yet have a category for. 4 black SUVs moving up his driveway. Lights off, wipers going, engine sound swallowed almost entirely by the rain. "Richard." His lawyer's voice tiny and distant from the phone speaker. "Richard, are you there?" "Richard." Sterling was a man who had survived 30 years of cutthroat real estate by trusting his instincts when they spoke clearly. They were speaking now. They were telling him something was wrong on a scale he had no framework for. "I'll call you back," he said and hung up. He went to his desk drawer and reached for the pistol he kept there, a Sig Sauer 9mm he had purchased after a business rival had made threats 6 years ago. Threats that had never materialized, but that had frightened him enough to get licensed. He had not fired it in 4 years. He picked it up now and checked the magazine the way he vaguely remembered the range instructor showing him, and was still standing behind his desk when the front door of his mansion opened. He had not heard a knock. He had not heard the alarm. Both of those things should have been impossible. He moved out of the study into the hallway, gun at his side because he was afraid, but still in this moment more embarrassed to be afraid than actually frightened. The lights in the front entryway were on. He could see the marble floor of the foyer, the console table with his keys still on it, the large mirror above it. He could see in that mirror the reflection of 2 men stepping through the front door in black rain gear, moving with the kind of practiced quiet efficiency that told him instantly and without any possibility of misreading it that these were not men who had come to negotiate. There were more behind them. "What?" He raised the gun. "This is private property. I have a weapon. I will." The man on the left looked at the gun with an expression of polite, distant boredom, reached out and took it from Richard's hand with such practiced ease that Richard had released it before he'd consciously decided to. He stood there for a moment with an empty hand, staring at this man, who was now holding his gun barrel pointed at the floor with the casual familiarity of someone who has handled a great many of them. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was precise, accented in a way Richard could not immediately place. "Eastern European, maybe Russian. Please don't do that again. It creates complications that no one wants." "Who are you?" Richard's voice was almost steady. "Who sent you? If this is about Hennessy, I want you to know that." "Mr. Sterling." The man placed the gun on the console table right next to Richard's keys with a kind of careful deliberateness that was somehow more frightening than anything he could have done with it. "My name is not important. The man whose name is important is outside. He would like to speak with you. I'm not speaking to anyone until someone tells me what the hell is happening in my house." The man's expression did not change. "Your house?" he said. "Yes, we can discuss that." He stepped aside and gestured toward the open front door, toward the rain and the dark and the sound of car engines idling. Richard Sterling looked at the open door, looked at the men on either side of it, looked at the staircase that led up to his wife, who had somehow he was beginning to understand, started something tonight that was vastly beyond anything he had ever anticipated. He walked to the door. Standing on the front steps of the mansion with the rain coming down around him and 4 black SUVs arrayed across his circular driveway was a man Richard Sterling had never seen before. He was perhaps 60 years old, perhaps older, the kind of age that settles into some men like weight and into others like stone. He wore a dark overcoat, no umbrella, and the rain didn't seem to bother him. Or perhaps he had simply decided long ago not to be bothered by things he couldn't control. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still, looking up at the house. When Richard appeared in the doorway, the man's eyes moved to him. They were pale eyes, blue or gray. It was hard to tell in the rain, and they moved over Richard with the slow assessing attention of someone taking inventory. "Mr. Sterling," the man said. His English was better than the men inside, formal, almost courtly. "My name is Mikhail Volov. I believe we have a great deal to discuss." He paused. "About my daughter." Richard Sterling felt the ground shift under him in a way that had nothing to do with the rain. He said, "I don't. Kate's father is." And then stopped because he realized he was about to finish that sentence with the word dead and that the man standing in front of him was not dead, had never been dead, and that everything Kate had ever told him about her family was something other than the truth. "Yes," said Mikhail Volov with the faintest possible suggestion of a smile. "I think we should go inside." Mikhail Volov stepped through the front door of the Sterling mansion like he owned it, which as Richard would come to understand over the next several hours, was not entirely an exaggeration. He did not rush. He did not look around the room with the wide eyes of a man impressed by wealth. He looked at the marble floors and the crystal chandelier and the oil paintings on the walls the way a man looks at a hotel room, assessing what was functional, dismissing the rest. 2 of his men moved in front of him, 2 more behind. They said nothing to each other. They didn't need to. Richard Sterling backed up 3 steps and then stopped himself from backing up further because he was still in some deep and stubborn part of himself Richard Sterling. And Richard Sterling did not back away from anyone in his own house. "I want to know who authorized you to come onto my property," he said. His voice had found some of its authority again. "Not all of it, but enough. Whatever this is, whatever you think you're doing, you need to understand that I have lawyers who will." "Sit down, Mr. Sterling." It was not a request. It had the cadence of a request, the politeness of one. But underneath that politeness was something structural like rebar inside concrete. And Richard heard it clearly enough that he sat. He sat in the chair nearest to him, the one by the fireplace in the entrance hall, the one his wife sometimes read in on Sunday mornings, and he sat in it with the rigid posture of a man trying to look like he'd chosen to sit rather than been told to. Mikhail Volov remained standing. "My daughter," he said, "called me approximately 47 minutes ago. Do you know what she told me?" Richard said nothing. "She told me," Volov continued with the measured patience of a man who had conducted this kind of conversation many times before, "that her husband struck her while she was carrying his child." He let that sentence sit in the room for a moment before he added, "She told me this in Russian." "Did you know she spoke Russian, Mr. Sterling?" A pause, then quietly. "No. No." Volov clasped his hands behind his back again. "There are many things you did not know about my daughter. We will get to those, but first I want you to answer a simple question for me because I am a man who likes to understand the nature of the people he is dealing with. Did you strike her?" Richard's jaw tightened. "That is between me and my wife." The man to Volov's left, the one who had taken the gun, the one with the bored expression, moved forward half a step. Just half a step. But Richard felt it the way you feel a temperature change. "Did you strike her?" Volov said again. Same tone, same volume. There was a disagreement. It escalated. "I did not intend." "Yes or no, Mr. Sterling?" The silence stretched. Richard Sterling looked at Mikhail Volov's eyes and found in them the particular quality of patience that has never needed to become impatience because it has always eventually gotten what it wanted. He looked away first. "Yes," he said. Volov nodded once slowly, like a man who had already known the answer and simply needed to hear it spoken aloud to complete a formality. "Thank you," he said, "for being honest. It will make the rest of this easier." He turned then and walked toward the staircase, and Richard came half out of his chair before two of the men in the room moved, and Richard sat back down without being touched, because he understood the geometry of what had just happened. "Where is she?" Volov said, not to Richard, but to the man on his right, who produced a phone and said something in Russian into it, and listened and then said in English, "East wing, end of the hall." Volov went up the stairs. Richard sat in the chair and listened to the footsteps and counted the men in the room, 3. He could see almost certainly more outside and the one who had gone upstairs and did the arithmetic and didn't like the result. Upstairs in the room at the end of the east wing hallway, Kate heard the knock. She had been sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, her knees drawn up as far as her belly allowed, holding the prepaid phone in both hands. She had not turned on the lights. She had been sitting in the dark because the dark felt safer than the light right now because in the dark she could not see her own reflection and she did not want to see her face. The knock came. 2 short, 1 long, a pattern she had not heard since childhood. She got up, opened the door. Her father looked at her face for exactly 2 seconds. Something moved behind his eyes, something that was not the controlled blankness he wore everywhere else. And then he stepped forward and put both hands on either side of her face gently with the careful precision of someone handling something precious and turned her face toward the light from the hallway. The bruise had fully risen now. The right side of her face from cheekbone to jaw deep red darkening toward purple. Mikhail Volov looked at it for a long moment. Then he lowered his hands and he said very quietly in Russian, "Should have come sooner. Papa." Her voice broke on the word and she hated that it broke. Hated the sound of her own weakness. But she was 7 months pregnant and her face was swollen and her father was standing in front of her for the first time in 10 years and her body simply could not sustain the performance of being fine. "How are you even?" She stopped, switched to English, switched back. "I didn't think you'd come yourself. Where else would I be?" He stepped inside. The room looked at her with the full weight of his attention and said, "Let me look at you." Not at the bruise, at her. The way he used to look at her when she was small, taking stock, measuring something internal. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "The baby?" "The baby's fine. I checked. I've been monitoring." "Good." He pulled the chair from the corner of the room and placed it in front of her and sat in it. And something about the gesture, the fact that he was the one who sat, that he was putting himself below her eye level, cracked something open in her chest. "Sit," he said. She sat on the edge of the bed. They looked at each other. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he agreed. "You didn't come to the wedding. You didn't invite me because you would have." She stopped, pressed her lips together. "I knew what you would have done if you'd met him. I knew what you would have found out about him. I wanted." She looked at her hands. "I wanted to believe I'd made the right choice. I needed to believe that without you in the room." Volov was quiet for a moment. Then, "And now?" She looked up. "He hit me. Papa, while I was pregnant, while I was carrying his child." Her voice was steady again. She had found it again somewhere in the last 30 seconds. That was the 3rd time. The 3rd time. She watched her father's face as he absorbed that number, watched the stillness in it. The kind of stillness that is not the absence of emotion, but the very tight container of it. "You should have called me after the first time," he said. "I know. Why didn't you?" And this was the question, wasn't it? This was the question she had been asking herself for 2.5 years. She looked at her father, this man who had raised her in a world built on power and violence and absolute loyalty, who had sent her away from that world at 19 because he wanted something different for her. Who had watched her leave and had not followed because she had asked him not to. And she tried to find the honest answer. Because calling you means admitting that I failed, she said. And calling you means becoming your daughter again, not Kate Sterling. Not just Kate. Katya Volkova, your heir. She paused. I wasn't ready for that. And now? She looked at him steadily. He hit me for the third time while I'm 7 months pregnant. I'm ready. Downstairs, Richard Sterling had been sitting in that chair for 9 minutes. He had been counting. He had also been watching the men in the room, cataloging, analyzing, trying to identify patterns of movement or attention that might give him an opening. There was no opening. These men were not guards at an event or bouncers at a club. They were something categorically different, and he knew it the way prey knows the difference between a dog and a wolf. He tried a different approach. I want to speak to whoever is in charge, he said to the room. No one responded. The man who came in, Volov, I want to speak to him directly. He let some of his boardroom authority back into his voice. I understand he's upset. As a father, I respect that, but there are two sides to every situation, and I think if we sit down, all three of us, Kate included, we can. Mr. Sterling. The man who had taken his gun was looking at him now. We appreciate your patience. I'm not being patient. I'm being. You are being patient, the man said with a finality that closed the subject like a door. Richard closed his mouth. He was a man who had spent 3 decades in rooms full of powerful people, and he had always known, always, who held the most power in any given room. It was usually him. The realization that it was very much not him tonight had been settling over him in layers since the moment those SUVs appeared in his driveway, and each layer was heavier than the one before it. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He reached for it slowly, watching the men in the room. No one moved to stop him. He looked at the screen. His lawyer. He answered it. Richard, what's happening? You said you'd call back. I need you to look something up for me, Richard said, keeping his voice low and even. Right now, I need you to look up the name Mikhail Volov, Eastern European, possibly Russian, connected to real estate or Volov. A pause on the line. A longer pause. Richard, where are you right now? I'm at home. Why? What did you find? I'm looking at. His lawyer's voice had changed. Some essential confidence had drained out of it. Richard, the Volov name is. There's a Mikhail Volov associated with the Volov syndicate. It's a. I mean the government designations alone. Another pause and Richard could hear typing. Richard, these are not people you negotiate with. These are not. Why is this name coming up in connection with you? He's in my house, Richard said. The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. Get out of there, his lawyer whispered. Right now. However you have to do it, get out. Richard looked at the 3 men around him at the front door, which had 2 more men posted just outside it at the staircase where Volov had disappeared 20 minutes ago. I don't think that's an option, he said, and hung up. 23 minutes had passed since Volov went upstairs. When he came back down, he walked into the entrance hall with the unhurried certainty of a man returning to a situation he had already resolved in his own mind. Kate was not with him. Richard noticed that immediately. Where is my wife? She is resting, Volov said. He took the chair across from Richard. Not Richard's chair, the one that had always been Richard's in this room, but a smaller chair that he moved to directly face him, and he sat with perfect composure. She needs to rest. We will not disturb her. She is my wife, Richard said, and heard the desperation in his own voice, and hated himself for it. Whatever she told you, whatever you think happened here tonight. I know what happened tonight, Volov said simply. My daughter told me. You told me. The bruise on her face confirms it. He leaned back slightly. "Mr. Sterling, I want to tell you something about my family, about who we are. I think it will help you understand the situation you are in." He paused. "My daughter grew up in a world that most people do not know exists. She was educated in 4 countries. She speaks 5 languages, including the one she was kind enough to set aside when she married you. She was trained from a very young age in the management of significant assets, the navigation of complex legal structures, and the kind of decision-making that most men with your level of wealth will never encounter." He watched Richard's face carefully as he spoke. "She left that world because I gave her the choice. Because I loved her enough to let her choose something different, and she chose you." Richard said nothing. "She chose a man," Volov continued, "who knew nothing about who she really was, who saw a beautiful, quiet, educated woman and saw something he could control, something he could diminish." He tilted his head slightly. "How long before the first time you hit her?" Silence. 8 months, Richard said. He did not know why he said it. The words came out before he could stop them. The way things come out when the pressure gets high enough. Volov looked at him. 8 months into the marriage. It was. Richard started and then stopped because there was no version of the next sentence that would help him. 8 months, Volov repeated. "She stayed for 3 years. I want you to think about what that means about my daughter's capacity for hope." He leaned forward now, elbows on his knees, and when he did, the entire atmosphere of the room contracted. "And I want you to think about what it means that she finally called me, because my daughter would not have made that call unless she had decided completely and without reservation that she was done." Richard's mouth was dry. "What do you want?" "Money." "Because I can." "I want you to listen." Volov said, not angry. Precisely not angry, which was worse. "You are going to listen to me and you are going to hear exactly what is going to happen next. And then you are going to sign the documents that my people have prepared and we are going to be finished here." "Documents?" Richard straightened. "What documents?" "I haven't agreed to." "Mr. Sterling." Volov raised one hand, just the hand. "You struck my pregnant daughter 3 times over the course of your marriage, and tonight badly enough that she bled. I have a physician on the way here right now to document the injury. I have financial forensics people who have spent the last 90 days reviewing every account, every holding, every shell company attached to your name." He paused. "I have been preparing for this phone call since the day you married her." Richard went cold. "You've been watching me." "I have been protecting my daughter." Volov said. "There is a difference." She did not know. That was her choice to make, to live outside my protection. And I honored it. But I prepared because I know men like you, Mr. Sterling, and I knew this call would come. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat and produced a single folded document. He set it on the table between them. Divorce, full asset settlement, the Greenwich property, the New York holdings, the 3 accounts. In the Cayman Islands. Yes, I know about those. Transferred to my daughter's name. Complete, uncontested. Richard stared at the document. Then he looked up. "And if I don't sign?" The room went very quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, the silence of held breath. Volov looked at him for a long moment. "Then we discussed the alternative," he said. "And I promise you, Mr. Sterling, you do not want to discuss the alternative." Richard's hands were shaking. He pressed them flat on his thighs to hide it. His mind was running through every option, every contact, every favor owed and lever he could pull. And each one he reached for crumbled before he could close his hand around it, because he was beginning to understand, truly understand in the cellular undeniable way that the man across from him had already reached those levers first, had already thought this through, had prepared for every move Richard might make the way a chess player prepares for an opponent who doesn't yet know he's playing. "You can't do this legally," Richard said. "Whatever these documents won't hold up. I'll contest them. You'll find," Volov said quietly, that they are entirely legal, ironclad, prepared by 3 of the finest attorneys in New York City over the course of the last 6 weeks. He paused. And you'll find that the documentation of your assault tonight, combined with the financial irregularities my team has identified in your business dealings, will make any attempt to contest the settlement significantly more damaging to you than simply signing. Richard's voice dropped to almost nothing. Who are you? I told you who I am. No. Richard looked at him. I mean, who are you? Kate told me her father was a property developer in Eastern Europe. She said he died when she was 12. She said what I asked her to say. Volov said. There was something in his voice as he said it, something that was not quite guilt but was adjacent to it. I asked her to say those things for her own protection, so that anyone who came close to her would not come close to me. He looked at Richard with a steadiness that was almost compassionate. It was not fair to her. I understand that now. And upstairs in the room at the end of the East Wing Hall, Kate Sterling sat with her hands folded over her belly and her back straight and her face calm in the way that faces go calm after they have finished with crying completely. Still not peaceful, but resolved. And she listened to the rain against the windows and thought about the girl she had been at 19 years old, putting her father on a plane and telling him she was going to live a normal life, whatever that meant. She thought about what normal had actually looked like. The first year when she'd believed it. The second year when she'd started to see the cracks. The third year when the cracks became craters and she had been so stubborn, so determined not to be Katya Volkova again that she had swallowed things no woman should swallow and stayed in a house that had become a cage and told herself every morning that she was choosing this. She had agency here. She was not her father's daughter. She pressed both hands flat against her belly. The baby moved slow and insistent like a heartbeat outside her heart. She was her father's daughter. She had always been. And tonight, sitting in the dark in the east wing of a mansion that was no longer Richard Sterling's, she stopped fighting that fact and let it settle over her like armor. Because that was what it was, not a prison, armor. She heard footsteps in the hall. A knock. One of her father's men opened the door and looked in. Miss Volkova, he said. First time she had heard that name spoken to her face in 10 years. She felt it land differently than she expected. Not like a collar, like a key. Your father asks if you would like to come downstairs. Kate looked at the door, looked at her hands, thought about Richard's face in that kitchen, looking down at her on the floor, that particular cold contempt in his eyes, the absolute certainty that she was beneath him, beneath accountability, beneath the basic dignity he afforded to every other human being he dealt with in his professional life. She stood up. Yes, she said. I would. She walked down the hall, walked to the top of the staircase, and she looked down into the entrance hall of a house she had lived in for 3 years and had never felt safe in. And she saw her father sitting across from her husband, and she saw the document on the table between them. And she saw Richard's face when he heard her footsteps and looked up and saw her standing at the top of the stairs. And for the first time since she had walked into this marriage, Kate watched Richard Sterling look at her and feel afraid. She came down the stairs slowly. Her posture was different than it had been 2 hours ago. Something had straightened in her spine. Not defiance exactly, not performance, but the rain habitation of something that had been there all along, waiting for her to come back to it. She crossed the room and stood beside her father's chair. Richard looked up at her. Kate. His voice was almost unrecognizable. The authority had been fully stripped from it now. What was left was something smaller and more naked. Kate, listen to me. Whatever he told you, whatever he's promised you, this is not who you are. You are not these people. You are my wife and we have a child coming. And if you just... Richard. Her voice was quiet and absolute. Sign the paper. He stared at her. Sign the paper, she said again, and this ends tonight. Everyone goes home. You keep your health and whatever your lawyers can salvage for you afterward. She held his gaze. Don't sign it, and my father explains to you what the alternative looks like. And I promise you, Richard, you do not want that conversation. She watched him look at her, watched him search her face for the woman he had married, for the compliance, the fear, the carefully managed smallness he had come to rely on, and find that she was not there. That she had perhaps never been entirely there, had only been borrowed, and that the loan had just been called in. He reached for the pen. The pen scratched across the bottom of the document at 11:22 in the evening, and Richard Sterling's hand was shaking so badly that his signature looked nothing like it normally did. He knew that. He looked at it, at this trembling, diminished version of his own name, and something inside him caved completely, the way a building doesn't fall all at once, but collapses floor by floor, each level giving way under the weight of the one above it. He dropped the pen on the table. No one in the room spoke for a moment. Vulov's man, the one with the bored expression who had taken the gun, picked up the document, examined the signature, and gave a single nod toward Vulov. Vulov looked at it briefly and then folded it and placed it back inside his coat without ceremony. The way a man files away something administrative. A task completed. A box checked. Richard looked at Kate. She was still standing beside her father's chair, her hands folded over her belly, her face showing him nothing useful. He searched it for anger, for satisfaction, for grief, for anything he could use, anything he recognized, and found only a kind of calm that frightened him more than any expression she could have worn. "You planned this," he said. His voice came out hollow. "You've been planning this." "I made a phone call," Kate said. "Tonight after you put me on the floor." "Don't." His jaw tightened. "Don't make it sound simple. Don't make it sound like." He stood abruptly and the two men in the room moved and then stopped when Vulov raised a hand. Richard stood there on his feet with nowhere to go and nothing to do with the energy of his own fury. "You lied to me. For 3 years you sat in this house and you lied to me about everything. Your family, your name, everything." Kate looked at him steadily. "I didn't lie to you about who I was. I showed you exactly who I was. You just decided to make me smaller than that. Your father is." He gestured toward Vulov with something between rage and bewilderment. "Do you understand what your father is? What he does? You think I'm the villain here? You grew up in..." "Richard." Her voice cut clean through his. Not loud, not sharp, just precise, the way a scalpel is precise. "You struck a pregnant woman tonight in your own kitchen. Everything else is noise." The silence that followed was absolute. Richard sat back down. He had nowhere else to go. Vulov rose from his chair, then unhurried and buttoned his coat. He looked at Richard with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but lived somewhere between them in the territory of a man who has seen too many other men reach the same point Richard had just reached. "My people will be in contact with your attorneys in the morning. I advise you to instruct them to cooperate fully. Any delay, any attempt to challenge the settlement, any communication directed at my daughter that she has not initiated herself will be interpreted as a decision to explore alternative arrangements." He paused. "I trust one don't need to explain what that means." Richard said nothing. "Good." Vulov turned to Kate. He switched to Russian, brief and quiet, and she answered in kind, and whatever passed between them in those few seconds was entirely theirs. Then he kissed her forehead, the unbattered side, gently with a formality that was also somehow entirely tender, and he walked toward the door. He stopped at the threshold without turning around. He said in English for Richard's benefit. "In my experience, Mr. Sterling, a man who raises his hand to a woman does so because he is afraid of what she would become if he didn't." He opened the door. "Tonight, you found out." He walked out into the rain. Kate stood in the entrance hall of her own house and listened to the sound of the SUVs pulling away one by one until the last engine sound faded into the storm. 2 of her father's men remained. She had not asked them to. She suspected her father had not asked either. They were simply staying because that was the protocol, and the Volov protocol did not require discussion. Richard had not moved from the chair. She really looked at him the way she had not allowed herself to look in a long time, because looking directly at something painful requires a kind of courage that is hard to sustain every day. He looked old, not in years. He was 54. He had always looked vigorous, had always worn his age the way wealthy men do, like an accessory. But in this moment, in this chair, he looked exhausted in a way that went all the way down. She almost felt something for him. She examined that almost feeling honestly, the way she'd learned to examine things honestly in the 2 therapy sessions she'd been allowed to have, and she determined that what she felt was not compassion exactly. It was more like the recognition of a creature that had been cornered and was no longer dangerous. The fear doesn't vanish immediately just because the threat does. But you can see it differently. You should sleep, she said to him. I'm going to need you coherent in the morning. There will be calls to make. He looked up. Are you serious? There's a guest room on the 3rd floor, she continued. I think it would be better if we didn't share the master tonight. Kate. His voice cracked on her name. Actually cracked the way a voice does when something foundational has given way beneath it. Kate, I know I've been. I know that tonight was. Richard. She stopped him. Not unkindly, but completely. Don't. I've heard that sentence so many times. I know every version of it. I know the version where you're sorry. I know the version where it'll never happen again. I know the version where you tell me that the stress is making you someone you're not. She shook her head slowly. I'm 7 months pregnant and I'm standing in my own hallway with my father's men in the next room and a bruise across half my face. We are past the version where you explain. He stared at her. Go upstairs, she said. 3rd floor. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll make it orderly. He stood. He walked to the staircase. He put his hand on the banister and stopped there for a moment with his back to her. And she could see the effort it cost him to climb those stairs. Not physical effort, but something else. The effort of a man ascending toward a future he had not designed and did not want. Did you ever love me? He asked, still not looking at her. She thought about it. She gave it the respect of an honest answer. Yes. She said. In the beginning, I did. He nodded once like a man receiving information he needed, even though it hurt. Then he climbed the stairs and she listened to his footsteps until they disappeared and a door closed somewhere on the 3rd floor. She stood alone in the entrance hall. The 2 remaining men were in the kitchen. She could hear the low sound of one of them making coffee, which under any other circumstances would have been surreal. She pressed both hands to her belly, closed her eyes, and took one long breath. Then she went to the sitting room, turned on one lamp, and sat down to wait for morning. She did not sleep. She had not expected to. She sat with her feet tucked beneath her carefully because her back had been aching all week. And she let her mind move through the night's events the way you move through a house after a flood, room by room, assessing damage. What had broken? What had held? What would need to be rebuilt? And what could simply be left in the water? At 2 o'clock in the morning, one of her father's men knocked softly on the door and said that her father was on the phone. She took the call in the sitting room, keeping her voice low out of habit, then caught herself and stopped keeping it low. That habit belonged to the old house, the house where Richard was always listening. She didn't live in that house anymore. The realization moved through her like something being unlocked. The physician will be there at 8, her father said. Documentation for the legal record. It needs to happen before the bruising fades. I know, she said. How are you feeling? The question was so simple, so direct. 3 words that no one in this house had asked her in. She couldn't remember. She looked at the ceiling for a moment and blinked and said, I'm all right. I'm more all right than I expected to be. That is the Volov in you, her father said. She almost smiled. Don't push it. A pause. Katya. He used her name, her real name. There are things we need to discuss about what comes next. About your position, your assets, the child's future. Not tonight, but soon. I know, she said again. You don't have to take on everything at once. I understand that. She shifted, adjusted the pillow behind her back. But I want to understand what I'm inheriting. All of it. Whatever you've been managing, I want to understand it properly this time. Another pause, longer this time. When her father spoke again, his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it since she was very young. Something that might in a different man have been called pride. Then we will sit down. When the baby is here and you are ready, we will go through everything. Everything, she confirmed. Everything, he said. She hung up and sat for a while longer in the lamplight and thought about the word everything, what it contained, what it demanded. The life she had tried to build away from her father's world had been in the end a kind of fiction, not because that life was impossible, but because she had tried to build it with the wrong person, on a foundation that had been compromised from the beginning. The question now was not whether to return to who she had been. She couldn't return. She was someone different now. She was a mother. 7 weeks from delivering, she was a woman who had survived something and bore the physical evidence of it on her face. The question was what she would build next, and on what foundation, and for whose sake. She pressed her palm flat against the lowest point of her belly, and felt the baby shift in response. She thought, we will figure it out. She thought it the way her mother used to say it, not as reassurance, but as instruction, a thing to be done. At 6:45 in the morning, she heard Richard come downstairs. She had expected him earlier. She had expected him in the small hours of the night to try something, to call someone, to attempt to access accounts, to do the thing that men like Richard always did when they felt the walls closing, which was to act before they had fully understood the dimensions of the room they were trapped in. She had been mildly surprised that he hadn't. She wondered as she heard his footsteps on the stairs, whether the night had taken something from him that was not coming back. He came to the door of the sitting room and stopped. He had changed out of the ruined suit. He was wearing the cashmere sweater she had given him for Christmas, a detail that struck her as strange, that of everything in his closet he had reached for the thing she had chosen. And he looked in the pale early morning light, genuinely diminished. Not strategically diminished, not performing exhaustion to elicit sympathy. Actually diminished. Reduced somehow in the way that very proud men are reduced when they can no longer outrun the truth of themselves. He looked at her face at the bruise in full daylight, which she knew was darker now than it had been last night. She watched his eyes take it in and watched something move through him that was not, she thought, entirely calculated. I need coffee, he said finally. There's a pot in the kitchen, she said. He went. She heard him moving around in there. Heard the particular sounds of a man navigating his own kitchen in a state of profound uncertainty. 2 of her father's men were still present. She heard Richard speak to them briefly, one clipped exchange and then silence and then the sound of a mug being set on the counter. He came back with a coffee he had not offered to make for her, and then stopped and looked at the empty cup on the table beside her and said, Do you want anything? It was such a small gesture, so insufficient. She looked at it for exactly 1 second and said, I'm fine. He sat down across from her, not in his usual chair. She noted the one nearest the fireplace that he always claimed by instinct, but in a smaller chair closer to the door, as if some internal authority over the space had already transferred. He held the coffee in both hands and looked at the floor. Your lawyers will be calling mine at 9 o'clock. Kate said, I need you to instruct your team to be cooperative. Any asset my father's people have flagged has been flagged correctly. Contesting them will cost you more than surrendering them. He looked up. Is there anything left? After all of it. She had thought about this. She had thought about it for several hours in the lamplight. The Aspen property isn't in the settlement. That was purchased before the marriage. It's yours. She paused. And whatever you can rebuild afterward, that's yours too. I'm not trying to destroy you, Richard. I'm leaving you. He was quiet for a moment. There's a difference. Yes, she said. There is. There. He looked at the bruise again. She let him look. She had decided sometime around 4 o'clock in the morning that she was not going to cover it. Not today, not in this house. She had spent 3 years making herself smaller and quieter and easier to manage, and she was done minimizing the evidence of that. I want you to know, he said, and stopped. I don't need you to. I want you to know, he said again, firmer this time in a way that surprised her, that I understand what I did. I'm not going to explain it. I'm not going to talk about the stress or the deal or any of. I understand what I did. He looked at his hands. I don't know when I became someone who could do that. I don't know when it started, but I know it was wrong all 3 times. I know. She listened to this, measured it. She had been waiting for 3 years to hear something like it, and now that it was here, sitting across from her in the early morning light, she found that it was not nothing. Not nothing. It mattered that he said it. She was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that, but it was also profoundly and permanently too late. I believe you, she said. I believe that you mean that right now, and I hope you hold on to it for the next person in your life. I hope you hold on to that and let it change something. She stood up carefully. But it doesn't change this. She walked to the doorway and stopped. She turned around. I want you out of the house by noon, she said. Take what you need for the week. The attorneys can arrange access for the rest. He looked at her, this woman he had married and underestimated and struck and thought he understood. And he nodded slowly with something that looked finally like actual reckoning. She went upstairs. The physician arrived at 8 o'clock sharp. A woman which Kate had not expected, but which she appreciated, a calm, precise woman in her 50s, who introduced herself as Dr. Harmon, and who conducted the examination with efficient, professional warmth. She photographed the injury. She checked the baby's heartbeat, strong and steady, 150 beats per minute, a sound that made Kate exhale in a way that reached all the way down. She documented everything in a format that would hold up in court. She asked Kate if she was safe now, and Kate said yes, and Dr. Harmon looked at the 2 men still present in the hallway outside the bedroom door and understood without further explanation the architecture of the situation. The bruising will peak in about 48 hours, Dr. Harmon told her. I want you to rest today. Real rest. Not the kind where you manage things from a horizontal position. She gave Kate a look that was professionally neutral and personally knowing. Is there someone who can be with you? My father is sending someone, Kate said. Good. Dr. Harmon packed her bag. At the door, she stopped. For what it's worth, she said. And I know it's not my place. I've done this kind of documentation before for other women. I've seen what happens when they stay, and I've seen what happens when they don't. She met Kate's eyes. You made the right call. Kate thanked her and listened to her footsteps go down the stairs. She heard the front door open and close. She heard shortly after another car on the driveway, not the black SUVs, smaller. She looked out the window and saw a woman she recognized, Elena, who had worked for her father since Kate was 12 years old, who had the kind of face that gave away nothing, and the kind of competence that gave away everything, stepping out of a dark sedan with a bag over each shoulder. Kate had not known Elena was coming, but she was not surprised. She changed her clothes, brushed her teeth, stood in front of the mirror for a moment, and looked at herself, at the bruise, at the circles under her eyes, at the 7-month belly that had somehow made it through the night intact, and said to her reflection quietly and without drama, okay. Then she heard the sound she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting for it. The front door, footsteps on the drive, a car door, an engine. Richard was leaving. She did not go to the window. She did not watch him go. She had watched him enough. She stood in the bathroom of the master bedroom. Her bedroom now simply and completely hers. And she listened to the sound of his car going down the driveway, the sound of the iron gate opening and then closing, and then the sound of nothing, of the rain that had finally stopped sometime before dawn, of the particular quiet that settles over a house after a long night. Elena knocked on the bedroom door at 9:15. "There's tea," she said in Russian. "And the attorneys are on the line when you're ready." "Give me 10 minutes, Kate said. She sat on the edge of the bed, the same spot where she'd sat last night with the prepaid phone in her hands, making the call she'd told herself she would never make. She thought about that woman, that version of herself 12 hours ago, with the shaking hands and the blood in her mouth and the terror of what she was about to set in motion. She felt an enormous tenderness toward her. The same tenderness she'd feel toward anyone who'd been brave enough to do the necessary thing when they were most afraid. She picked up her phone, her real phone. She had 17 text messages and 4 missed calls from people who did not yet know that her life had fundamentally changed overnight. She would deal with them in time. She set the phone down. She looked at the window, at the gray morning light, at the tree line at the edge of the property, the old oaks that she had always liked and that she would now get to keep. Her daughter. They had learned the gender 6 weeks ago, and Richard had wanted a son, and Kate had said nothing, had simply filed the information away in the part of herself she kept private, moved inside her. A slow, rolling turn that Kate now recognized as a particular kind of restlessness. "And I am awake now. I am here now." The same movement she made every morning around this time. "I know," Kate said softly. "I know we're awake." She pressed her palm flat against the movement and held it there and felt underneath all of it, underneath the exhaustion and the pain and the enormous complicated machinery of what came next. Something she had not felt in this house in a very long time. Something she had nearly forgotten was possible. She felt safe. And in the hallway outside her door, Elena was setting down the tea tray and the attorneys were holding on the line and her father's men were making their way quietly out to the car because the danger was gone and the protocol had shifted and the Sterling mansion had become in the space of a single night simply a house. Kate's house with Kate's name on the deed that was being processed right now in a legal office in Midtown Manhattan by 3 of the best attorneys that Mikhail Vulov's money had ever retained. At 9:25, Kate opened the bedroom door. "All right," she said to Elena in English, and then felt herself settle into it. "All right, let's get started." The first attorney call lasted 47 minutes. Kate sat at the desk in the study. Richard's study, the room she had rarely been invited into, the room that smelled like his whiskey and his ambition. And she listened to 3 lawyers talk over each other about asset transfers and injunctions and the legal implications of a witness signature obtained under what Richard's team would almost certainly call duress. She listened carefully. She asked 4 questions, each one precise, each one cutting to the center of what she actually needed to know. When the call ended, the lead attorney, a man named Calloway, who had been her father's American counsel for 11 years, paused before hanging up and said, "Miss Volkova, I have to say you've absorbed this faster than most clients I've worked with." "I've been preparing for this conversation for 3 months," she said. A brief silence. "Of course," Calloway said. "We'll speak again at noon." She hung up and sat for a moment in Richard's chair, the leather one behind the desk, the one he had always been sitting in whenever she'd had the misfortune of needing something from this room. She noticed that it fit her differently than she would have expected. Not too large, not uncomfortable. She placed her hands flat on the desk surface and looked at the room and thought without ceremony, "This is mine now." Elena appeared in the doorway at 10:15 with a cup of tea and the expression of a woman who has been managing the logistics of complicated situations for so long that she has become indistinguishable from the situation itself. "Your father called while you were on with Calloway. She said he'll call back at 11. Also, there's someone at the gate." Kate looked up. "Who?" "A woman. Says her name is Diane Mercer. Says she's a friend of yours." Kate was quiet for a moment. Diane Mercer was her closest friend in Greenwich. The only person in this town she had trusted even partially. The woman who had brought her soup twice without asking questions and who had once 8 months ago looked at a bruise on Kate's wrist and not said a word, but whose eyes had said everything. She had not told Diane anything. She had been protecting Diane or protecting herself or protecting the fragile fiction of her marriage. She wasn't entirely sure which. "Let her in," Kate said. Diane came through the front door with the energy of a woman who had driven very fast and was trying to pretend she had not. She was 41, auburn-haired, sharp in the way that women become sharp when they've spent 41 years paying attention. And she stopped in the entrance hall and looked at Kate's face and said nothing for a full 3 seconds. Then she said, "Tell me what you need." Kate felt something loosen in her chest. Not break, loosen. The way a knot loosens when the right amount of pressure is applied in exactly the right direction. "Tea," she said, "and to sit somewhere that isn't his study." They went to the sitting room. Elena brought tea and then disappeared with the tact of someone who understood that this conversation needed to happen without witnesses. Diane sat across from Kate and looked at the bruise and still did not say the thing that most people would say. The horrified exclamations, the questions about why and how long and what are you going to do, because Diane was not most people. "He's gone," Kate said. "He left this morning. The divorce is filed. The assets are transferring." Diane wrapped both hands around her mug. "All of it. One night. All of it." "Kate." Diane shook her head slowly. "How?" "My father," Kate said. Diane stared at her. "Your father? The one who? The one who died when I was 12. Kate held her friend's eyes. "He didn't." The silence that followed was the kind that comes when someone hands you a piece of information so different from what you've been holding that your brain needs a moment to physically rearrange itself. Diane's mouth opened, closed. She set down her mug. "He's been alive this whole time." "Yes. And last night he came with several cars and several men and a document that Richard signed." Kate kept her voice level. "And now Richard is gone and I have attorneys on the phone every 45 minutes and my father's people are making sure the asset transfers go through without interference." Diane looked at her for a long moment. Then she said with the particular bluntness that Kate had always loved about her, "Who exactly is your father, Kate?" Kate picked up her tea, took a measured sip, set it down. "The kind of man," she said carefully, "who, when his daughter calls him at 10 o'clock at night because her husband struck her, arrives in Connecticut within 2 hours with 4 vehicles and a fully prepared legal settlement." She met Diane's eyes. "The kind of man who has been monitoring my marriage from a distance for 3 years because he knew even when I didn't want to admit it that Richard was exactly the kind of man he turned out to be." Diane absorbed this. "And you're okay with that with who he is?" "I'm 7 months pregnant with a bruise on my face and my father got me out in one night," Kate said quietly. "I'll work out the philosophical complications later." Diane reached across and took her hand, held it, didn't say anything else. That was, Kate thought, precisely the right response. At 11 o'clock sharp, her father called. He opened without preamble, which was his way. "The Cayman transfers will clear by 4 this afternoon. The New York holdings are more complicated. There are 3 corporate entities layered between Sterling and the actual assets which his attorneys constructed specifically to make this kind of transfer difficult. Callaway is working on it. It will take 48 hours, not 24. Is that acceptable?" "Yes," Kate said. "There is something else." A pause not long but noticeable. Her father did not pause unless he was measuring what he was about to say. "Sterling made a call this morning before he left the house, not to his attorneys." Kate felt something tighten in her chest. "Who did he call?" "A man named Gerald Fitch." "Do you know the name?" She thought vaguely. "A business associate from before the marriage. Gerald Fitch is also a Connecticut state senator." Her father said. "Sterling has a relationship with him that goes back 22 years. They have done a number of things together that neither of them wants examined. Another pause. Fitch called 2 people this morning after speaking with Sterling. One was a private attorney who specializes in emergency injunctions. The other was a contact at the state police. Kate's hand tightened on the phone. Richard is trying to challenge the settlement. Richard is trying to build a narrative. Her father corrected. He is going to argue that the signature was obtained under coercion. That armed men entered his home and threatened his life. That the document is therefore invalid. A beat. He is not entirely wrong about the armed men. Can he make that work? Not easily. The document is legally sound. The witnesses are credible and the injuries on your face are documented. But it creates noise. It creates delay. And in my experience, delay is the enemy of resolution. A third pause. And this one carried weight. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this becomes public. Katya. Sterling has political connections. If he pulls Fitch fully into this, it may reach the press before we finish the legal process. Kate stood up from the desk and walked to the window. She stood there looking at the bare oaks at the edge of the property. Let it, she said. I'm sorry. Let it go public. She surprised herself with how certain she sounded. She stood with that certainty for a moment, testing its weight, making sure it was real. It held. Richard has spent 30 years building a reputation on the appearance of power and control. The story of what actually happened in this house, a man who hit his pregnant wife 3 times over 3 years and signed his assets away the night his father-in-law showed up at the door. That is not a story that helps him. Not with investors. Not with partners, not with anyone. She turned away from the window. If he wants to make this public, let him. A long pause on the other end. Then her father said, and it was the most clearly she had ever heard pride in his voice. All right. But Papa, I want it done cleanly. Nothing that comes back on us. Nothing that gives anyone ammunition about your involvement beyond what's already documented. Of course, he said that has always been the plan. They talked for another 12 minutes, working through specifics. And when the call ended, Kate held the phone in her hand for a moment and thought about what her father had just told her, about Richard calling Fitch, about the emergency injunction attorney. She had expected Richard to try something. She knew him well enough for that, but she had expected it to take longer. She had expected at least a day of shock before the survival instinct kicked back in. He must have called Fitch before he left the house, maybe before sunrise. She felt briefly something that was not quite admiration, but was at least acknowledgement. He was still fighting. She had taken almost everything from him in a single night, and he was already on the phone with his senator. That was, she supposed, what 30 years of combat in the real estate world looked like when it had nowhere else to go. It wasn't going to work, but she noted it. Diane had stayed. Kate found her in the kitchen with Elena, the two of them in the stiff, polite configuration of people who have decided to tolerate each other for someone else's benefit. And the sight of it almost made Kate laugh, which surprised her because she had not thought she had a laugh anywhere in her body today. I need to tell you something, Kate said to Diane. And I need you to listen without reacting for at least 30 seconds. Diane turned from the counter. That is a deeply alarming way to begin a sentence. Richard called a state senator this morning. He's going to try to challenge the settlement. It may end up in the press. Kate looked at her friend steadily. I want you to know before it happens because some of what comes out will involve my father, and my father is not. He is not the kind of person that most people in Greenwich have ever dealt with. And I want you to hear it from me first and decide for yourself what you do with it. Diane crossed her arms. What kind of person is your father, Kate, actually? Kate told her not everything. There were things she was still assembling herself, truths she was still adjusting to, but enough. The structure of it, the family business, the years of distance, and the wire of connection that had stayed taut between them regardless. The phone she'd bought at a gas station in Stamford, the number she'd memorized at 7 years old. Diane listened. She was very still in the way she got when something was serious. When Kate finished, Diane said, "Does this change anything for you about who you are?" Kate thought about it honestly. "It changes the shape of things," she said. "Not the center." At 1:45 in the afternoon, Calloway called with news that stopped Kate in the middle of a sentence she was saying to Elena about dinner. Richard's attorneys had filed for an emergency hearing. Not a full challenge to the settlement, not yet, but a temporary restraining order against the asset transfers, citing the coercion argument her father had anticipated. The hearing was set for the following morning, 9 o'clock, Westchester County. Kate stood in the hallway with the phone pressed to her ear and listened to Calloway explain the implications in the measured tones of a man managing a client's composure. And she felt the first real surge of fury she'd had all day move through her like a current. Not because the move surprised her, because of the audacity of it, because Richard Sterling had stood in his kitchen and struck her to the floor and then gone upstairs and slept and then picked up a phone and called in every favor he had to make her prove in open court that she deserved to keep what was already legally and morally hers. "Calloway," she said, interrupting a sentence about procedural timelines. "What do we need to win tomorrow? We have strong documentation. The signed agreement. The physician's report. 2 witnesses to the signing. The coercion argument is weak because the document is. What else do we need?" A pause. "Ideally, Miss Volkova, we would benefit from any documentation of the prior incidents. The 2 previous assaults you described, text messages, photographs, medical records, if you sought treatment, anything that establishes a pattern of behavior that contextualizes what happened last night." Kate was quiet for a moment. Her mind was moving quickly through 3 years of careful, exhausted self-preservation. "How quickly do you need it?" "Close of business today." She hung up and turned to Elena. "I need my laptop and I need you to go to the master bedroom top shelf of the closet. There's a dark green box behind the spare blankets. Bring it to me." Elena went without asking questions. Kate went to the sitting room and opened the laptop and began to move through files she had been keeping for 2 years and 2 months. A folder she had labeled with the particular dark practicality of someone who has thought about leaving many times before actually leaving, simply with the letter E for evidence. A folder she had never shown anyone. A folder she had added to and returned to and sometimes stared at for long minutes before closing it and telling herself she wasn't ready. She was ready now. When Elena returned with the green box, Kate opened it without ceremony. Inside 3 photographs she had taken herself on her real phone in the bathroom with the door locked, of 2 bruises and 1 cut above her eye that she had told Richard she got from walking into a cabinet door in the dark. A single handwritten note she had made to herself after the second incident, dated and timed in the precise compressed handwriting she used when she needed to make something external, something she could point to, something that existed outside of her own memory. A printed email from an address no one knew she had sent to that same address, timestamped, describing what had happened with the kind of cold clinical detail that had taken her an hour to write because she had to take breaks to breathe. She looked at the contents of the box on the table in front of her. 2 years of quiet, careful, exhausted preparation. 2 years of some part of her knowing, even when the rest of her was too tired or too frightened or too stubborn to act, that this box might be necessary someday. She photographed each item with her phone, forwarded everything to Calloway, sent the digital folder from the laptop, done by 2:40. Calloway called back at 3:15. "This is more than sufficient," he said, and the relief in his voice was only partially professional. "The hearing tomorrow will not go the way Mr. Sterling expects." She thanked him and set the phone down and sat for a long moment with her hands in her lap. The box was still open on the table. She looked at it, at the photographs, at the note in her own handwriting, and she felt moving through her alongside the exhaustion and the resolution and the low steady thrum of fury, something unexpected. Something she had not anticipated feeling today of all days. Grief. Not for Richard, or not only for Richard, for the years in that box, for the woman who had taken those photographs alone in a locked bathroom and then hidden them in a green box behind the spare blankets because she wasn't ready. For all the morning she had stood in front of a mirror and told herself it wasn't that bad, that she was managing, that she had chosen this, and could unchoose it on her own terms, in her own time. For the version of herself that had believed for longer than she should have that love was something you could survive by making yourself small enough to fit inside someone else's idea of it. She pressed one hand over her eyes. She gave herself exactly 90 seconds. She counted them. Then she closed the box, put it aside, and called her father. "The hearing is tomorrow morning," she said when he picked up. 9 o'clock, I know, he said. Calloway already briefed me. I want to be there. A pause. Katya. I want to be there, she said again. And her voice had the thing in it that she recognized from his voice. The thing she had inherited without knowing the structural certainty that lived beneath the surface. I am not going to sit in this house while attorneys argue about my face and my marriage and my right to be safe. I am going to be in that room. Her father was quiet for 3 full seconds. All right, he said. And Papa, I don't want you there. I'm sorry. I don't want you in the courtroom. I don't want your men visible. I don't want the Vulov name attached to tomorrow. I want it to be clean. I want it to be Kate. She paused. Just Kate. Another silence. This is a risk, he said. If Sterling's attorney tries to. I know it's a risk. She sat up straighter. I've been living with risk for 3 years. I know what it feels like. I can manage it. A breath. Let me do this part. He took longer to respond this time. She could hear him on the other end of the phone doing the thing he always did when he was genuinely uncertain. The small exhale through the nose. The brief silence that meant he was actually considering rather than simply processing. She had forgotten she knew that sound until she heard it again. You will have Calloway, he said finally, and Reeves as second chair. They are both excellent. I know. And you will call me the moment it is finished. Yes. And Katya. He stopped, started again. You were never just Kate. I want you to know that I understand why you needed to be, but you were never just that. She held the phone and looked at the window and the last of the afternoon light coming through it. And she thought about the girl who had gotten on a plane at 19 and told her father she was going to live a normal life. And she thought about the woman sitting in this room right now with a green box on the table and a bruise on her face and 3 of New York's finest attorneys going to bat for her tomorrow morning. And she thought about how the distance between those 2 people was not as vast as she had believed because they were the same person. They had always been the same person. One of them had just been hiding for a while. I know, she said quietly. I know that now. She hung up, looked at the clock. 4:18, the asset transfers from the Cayman accounts had cleared. Calloway had confirmed it before the last call. The Greenwich property deed transfer was in process. The New York corporate holdings were the last piece and those would resolve after tomorrow's hearing one way or another. Diane was still there. She had moved to the kitchen and was doing the thing she always did in a crisis, which was to cook something. And the smell of it was filling the house with a warmth that Kate had not realized until she walked in and smelled it how desperately she had missed. How long it had been since this house had smelled like something other than tension. Chicken soup, Diane said without turning around. Don't argue with me. You need to eat something that isn't tea. I have a court hearing tomorrow morning. Kate said. Diane did turn around then looked at her. What? Richard filed for an emergency hearing trying to block the transfers. She sat down at the kitchen island. I'm going. Kate. I'm going. She said again, and I'm fine. And Calloway is the best in the state. She looked at her friend. But I need you to do something for me. Anything. The woman I've been for the last 3 years, the one who kept herself small, who covered bruises, who said she walked into a cabinet door. I need you to be a witness to the fact that she existed, that she was real, that what happened to her was real. Her voice held steady. Because tomorrow in that room, there's going to be a man and his attorney trying to rewrite what happened in this house. And I need to know that someone who saw it, even if they only saw the edges of it, is willing to say what they saw. Diane was very still. I'll be there, she said. You don't have to, Kate. Diane's voice was firm and clear and full of the particular warmth of someone who has decided without hesitation to put themselves fully on someone else's side. I'll be there in the room outside the room. Wherever you need me, I'll be there. Kate looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once the way her father nodded when something was decided. She ate the soup. She ate all of it because Diane was right. Because she needed it, because she was 7 months pregnant and going to court in the morning, and her body was the only instrument she had for everything that needed to happen next. She ate slowly and carefully and with the deliberate attention she had been giving to everything today, the attention of a woman who has stopped sleepwalking through her own life and started actually inhabiting it. Elena came to the kitchen at 7 o'clock and said quietly that there was a development. Kate set down her spoon. What kind? Gerald Fitch, Elena said. The senator, he pulled out. A pause. Apparently, a mutual acquaintance of your father's had a conversation with him this afternoon. He has informed Richard's attorneys that he is unable to assist with the hearing and has no further involvement in the matter. Kate looked at Elena. Then she said, my father. I wouldn't know, Elena said with the polished neutrality of a woman who knew everything. Richard had lost his political cover. Without Fitch, the emergency hearing tomorrow was just a man with a contested signature and a weak coercion argument against a documented pattern of abuse and a signed witnessed agreement. Kate did not feel triumphant about this. She felt the way you feel when a storm you've been watching on the horizon finally moves in a different direction. Not relief exactly, the release of held breath. She went to bed at 9:30. The first time she had chosen her own bedtime in 3 years. She lay on her side, the only position comfortable at 7 months, with one hand under her cheek and one hand on her belly. And she listened to the silence of the house, her house. And she thought about tomorrow, about walking into that courtroom with her name and her bruise and her green box full of careful, quiet evidence, about standing finally in a room where the truth of what had happened to her would be spoken aloud by people whose job it was to make it stick. She was not afraid. She examined herself honestly in the dark and found that she was not afraid. She was something else, something she recognized after a moment as ready. The baby moved slow and deliberate the way she always did at this hour. Tomorrow, Kate said softly. We'll tell them everything. She was awake before the alarm. 5:47 in the morning, the room still dark, the house still quiet, and Kate was already sitting up with both hands on her belly and her mind already moving through the sequence of the day ahead. She had slept better than she had any right to. 6 hours uninterrupted, which was more than she'd managed on any single night in the past 3 years. She thought about what that meant and decided it meant exactly what it felt like. The body knows when it's safe. It had been waiting a long time to prove it. She dressed carefully, not the way she used to dress for Richard's events, the studied performance of a wife who understood her decorative function, but carefully in the sense of deliberately. She chose the dark blue dress because it was clean and professional and because the color was one she had always liked and had stopped wearing somewhere in the second year of the marriage because Richard had once said it made her look severe. She put it on and stood in front of the mirror and looked at herself in it and thought, I look exactly like myself. The bruise was at its peak as Dr. Harmon had predicted. The full spectrum of it showed now, the deep purple at the center fading to red at the edges. She looked at it in the mirror without flinching. She considered covering it. She rejected the consideration. She was going to sit in a courtroom today and tell the truth, and the truth was written on her face, and she was not going to paint over it for anyone's comfort. Elena drove her. Diane was already at the courthouse when they arrived, standing outside in the pale 9 o'clock light with a coffee in each hand, wearing the kind of expression that meant she had not slept much and was not going to mention it. She held out one of the coffees and Kate took it, and they did not hug, which was correct because this was not the moment for softness. This was the moment for standing straight. Calloway was waiting inside with his second chair. A younger woman named Reeves who had the focused, slightly coiled energy of someone who does their best work under pressure. They found a quiet corner and Calloway went through the morning structure in 12 minutes flat, quick, precise, no waste. Richard's attorney was a man named Hargrove, senior partner at a white shoe firm in Midtown. Expensive and aggressive. And according to Calloway, somewhat thrown by the departure of Gerald Fitch from the picture. He expected to walk in here with political cover. Calloway said, he doesn't have it anymore. That changes his footing significantly. What will he argue? Kate asked. Duress, coercion. He'll describe last night as a home invasion by agents of a foreign criminal organization and argue that the signature was extracted under physical threat. Calloway paused. He will also attempt to introduce character information about your father. Kate nodded. She had expected this. And we will object at every turn and the judge will sustain most of them because the character of a third party is not relevant to whether a signature was freely given when documentation of the circumstances exists. He looked at her. The documentation you provided last night is the center of our case, Miss Volkova. The photographs, the note, the emails. They established that what happened last night was not an isolated incident weaponized to extort a signature. They establish a pattern, a history, context. He held her gaze. You may be asked to speak to that history directly. Are you prepared for that? Yes, she said without hesitation. They entered the courtroom at 8:59. Richard was already seated at the opposing table. He had dressed with care, the dark suit, the conservative tie, the silver cufflinks she had given him on their second anniversary. He looked composed from a distance. Up close, as Kate walked past him to reach her table, she could see the effort that composure was costing him. His jaw was set too tightly. His hands on the table were absolutely still in the specific way that hands are still when they are being consciously controlled. He looked at her face when she passed at the bruise. Something moved through his expression there and gone in half a second. And then his attorney leaned over and said something in his ear, and Richard looked away. Kate sat down, folded her hands on the table, looked at the front of the room. She felt in that moment extraordinarily calm, not the performed calm she had maintained for 3 years in the kitchen of the Greenwich house, the calm of someone managing the distance between themselves and danger. This was something else, the calm of a woman who has nothing left to hide. The judge entered at 9:04. The Honorable Patricia Wynne, 61 years old, with reading glasses on a chain and an expression of considered neutrality that gave away precisely nothing. She settled in, opened the file in front of her, looked over it for 40 seconds of silence that felt considerably longer, and said, Mr. Hargrove, you filed for a temporary restraining order against asset transfers executed under a settlement agreement signed last night. Walk me through the basis. Hargrove was on his feet immediately. He was silver-haired, wide-shouldered, the kind of attorney who understood that physical presence was half the argument. He laid out his case smoothly and with complete confidence: the arrival of vehicles, the men inside the house, the atmosphere of threat, the signature extracted in circumstances no reasonable person would characterize as voluntary. He used the word coercion 11 times. He used the phrase foreign criminal elements twice and watched the judge's face carefully each time he did. Judge Wynne listened without expression. Mr. Calloway, she said. Response. Calloway stood. He was quieter than Hargrove, more precise. He introduced the settlement document, the witnesses present at the signing the physician's report. He introduced the photographs Kate had taken in a locked bathroom over 2 years. He introduced the dated written note. He introduced the emails time-stamped clinical written by a woman who had known she might need them one day. He said with exactly the right weight that the question before the court was not who had been in the room when the document was signed, but whether the woman who signed it had done so of her own free will, and that the evidence of her 2 years of careful self-documentation answered that question without ambiguity. Then he said, Your Honor, my client is present and available to speak to the history she has documented if the court finds it useful. Judge Wynne looked at Kate over her reading glasses. Miss Volkova, she said, and Kate noticed everyone in the room noticed that the judge used her name, not Sterling. Volkova. Either Calloway had briefed the name change or the judge had read the file thoroughly enough to understand what name this woman was operating under today. Yes, Your Honor, Kate said and stood. She was sworn in. She sat in the witness chair and looked at the room and felt the baby shift once low and slow as if settling in alongside her, and she found that centering rather than distracting. Calloway walked her through it methodically. The first incident, the date, the circumstances, the injury, the reason she had not reported it. She answered each question in full sentences, specific and clear, neither minimizing nor dramatizing, because she had been raised by a man who understood the power of precision. And it turned out that was a thing you kept even when you were trying to be someone else. The second incident, the third last night, the green box, the years of documentation. Hargrove objected 7 times. Judge Wynne sustained 2. When Calloway sat down, Hargrove approached for cross-examination with the energy of a man executing a prepared strategy. He went directly for her father. Miss Volkova, is it correct that the men who entered your husband's home last night were employed by your father, Mikhail Volov? Yes, Kate said. And is it correct that your father is the head of an organization that the United States Treasury has designated as a objection? Calloway said relevance. Your Honor, Hargrove said turning to the judge. The character and nature of the third parties involved in. I'll allow it. Judge Wynne said briefly. Hargrove turned back to Kate. He repeated the question. Kate looked at him steadily. My father runs significant business interests across multiple countries. She said, I am not here to characterize those interests. I am here to speak to the 3 times my husband struck me during our marriage. She paused. If Mr. Hargrove would like to redirect to that topic, I'm happy to continue. Someone in the room made a sound. Not a laugh, something smaller. The involuntary release of held breath. Hargrove pivoted. Isn't it true that you concealed your family identity from Mr. Sterling throughout your marriage? I didn't volunteer information about my family. No. And isn't that concealment itself a form of? Mr. Hargrove. Judge Wynne's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I'm going to ask you to connect this line of questioning to the restraining order before us or move on. Hargrove moved on. He tried 3 more angles, each one finding the same wall. Kate's composure, her precision, her absolute refusal to be redirected away from what had actually happened in that house. She did not perform emotion. She did not need to. The fact she had spent 2 years carefully assembling did the work that emotion would have undermined. When he was finished, he sat down. Kate watched him lean over to Richard and say something low. Richard's response was a single word. She could not hear it. Judge Wynne removed her reading glasses. She took 45 seconds to review the documents in front of her. The courtroom was very quiet. The motion for a temporary restraining order is denied. She said the documentation presented by the respondent establishes clear context for the circumstances of the agreement and demonstrates a voluntary decision made in the interest of personal safety. The asset transfers will proceed as outlined in the settlement. She looked over the room. I would also note for the record that the medical documentation in this file will be referred to the Westchester County DA's office for review of potential criminal statutes. That is all. She stood. Everyone stood. Kate sat for 1 moment longer before she rose. Just 1 moment with her hands flat on the arms of the witness chair and her eyes at the front of the room. And she thought about the woman in the bathroom with the camera, taking photographs of her own bruises and hiding them in a green box behind the spare blankets. She thought about what she would say to that woman if she could. She thought she would say it counted. Every careful, exhausted thing you did in that room alone, it counted. You were building something even when you thought you were just surviving. She stood up. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Richard caught up to her. His attorney was 2 steps behind him saying something low and urgent, and Richard was not listening. He came to a stop 3 feet from her, and they stood in the hallway with Calloway and Diane and Elena forming a loose constellation around them, and Richard looked at Kate with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not anger, not contempt. Something stripped of both those things. "It's over," he said. He said it like a question that already knew its answer. "Yes," Kate said. "The baby." He looked at her belly. I want to be in her life. I know I don't have the right to ask that. I know what I've done, but I'm asking." Kate looked at him for a long moment. She thought about her daughter, the weight and reality of her 7 weeks away from being in the world. And she thought about what that daughter deserved in terms of a father and what she deserved in terms of a mother who modeled what it looked like to face the truth of things. "That will be for the courts to decide," she said, "and for her to decide when she's old enough. I'm not going to make that choice for either of you." She held his eyes. "But I will tell you this, the man who existed in that kitchen last night, I will not allow that man near my daughter. Who you become after this, that's yours. That's entirely up to you." She paused. "I genuinely hope it's someone different." She walked away. She did not look back. She walked through the courthouse doors with Diane at her left side and Elena at her right and Calloway just behind. And she walked out into the morning and the clean air of a day that was nothing like the night that had produced it. And she stopped on the steps and took a breath that reached all the way down. Diane put her hand through Kate's arm. "Breakfast," she said. "Somewhere expensive." "My treat." Kate almost laughed. She did laugh. A small one. Real, the kind that comes from somewhere you forgot existed. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." Her father called at 10:20 while they were sitting at a corner table in a restaurant in White Plains that Diane had chosen because it was quiet and the booths were deep and no one would bother them. Kate had ordered eggs and toast and was eating them with genuine appetite, which she noted as a positive development. "Calloway briefed me," her father said. "I figured. Judge Wynne is a good judge." He said fair. She was. Kate agreed. A pause. "The DA referral." "I know," Kate said. "I expected it. It's fine. It's correct." She took a sip of orange juice. "I wanted it to go wherever it goes without interference from anyone." A beat. "Understood," her father said. And she heard him mean it. "Papa." She set down the glass. "I want to start the conversations we talked about the business, about the structure. I want to understand everything properly." A pause of her own. "But I need 6 weeks first. The baby is 6 weeks out. I need those 6 weeks." "Of course," he said, "take the time and then I want to sit down with you. Just you and me and whatever documents you need to show me. No Calloway, no Elena, no intermediaries." She heard herself say it and recognized the voice she was using, her father's cadence, his precision. The inheritance she had been running from for 10 years. "I want to understand it from you directly." The silence on the other end lasted 4 full seconds. Then Mikhail Volov said, "I have been waiting for that conversation for a very long time." "I know," Kate said. "I wasn't ready before. And now." She looked across the table at Diane, who was reading the menu with elaborate focus and pretending not to listen to a conversation in a language she didn't speak. She looked at the morning light coming through the window. She thought about the 6 weeks ahead, the baby coming, the house that was fully and completely hers. The green box that had done its work and could now be properly disposed of, the long process of rebuilding something on a foundation that was real. This time, actually solid, not constructed from performance and hope, and the stubborn refusal to admit failure. She thought about who she was now. Katya Volkova, who had been Kate Sterling, who had been a woman in a locked bathroom with a camera, who had been a girl memorizing a phone number at 7 years old, who was going to be a mother in 6 weeks, who had walked into a courtroom this morning with a bruise on her face and told the absolute truth and won. "Now I'm ready," she said. She hung up and picked up her fork and ate her eggs. If this story has kept you with us this far, please subscribe so you never miss what comes next for Kate and her daughter. 3 weeks after the hearing, the Westchester County DA's office opened a formal investigation into Richard Sterling for domestic assault. The documentation was extensive. 3 incidents, 2 years of evidence, a physician's report, and the testimony of a woman who had stopped being afraid to speak. Richard's attorneys released a statement saying he was cooperating fully. Kate released no statement. She had said everything she needed to say. 5 weeks after the hearing, the final New York corporate holding transferred to Kate's name. The legal architecture that Richard had spent a decade constructing to protect his assets had in the end protected hers. Calloway sent her a note. It said only complete. She folded it and put it on her desk and felt something settle in her chest with a finality that was almost physical. 6 weeks after the hearing on a Tuesday morning when the light was just beginning to suggest that winter might eventually become spring, Kate's daughter arrived. She was 7 pounds and 4 ounces with dark hair and pale eyes that the nurses said would probably change color in the coming weeks. But that looked in this first hour startlingly like her grandfather's. Kate held her and looked at her and felt the full force of something she did not have a word for. Not joy exactly, though it was that too, but something larger, something that contained all of the last year and the last 3 years and the last 10 years, and compressed them into this single point. This child, this room, this morning, this beginning. She called her father from the hospital bed with the baby on her chest. "She's here," Kate said. A silence. When her father spoke, his voice was different than she had ever heard it. Stripped of its architecture. Just a man. "Is she healthy?" "Perfect." Kate said she's perfect. "And you?" Kate looked at her daughter's face, at the dark hair and the pale eyes and the particular concentrated gravity of a brand new person encountering existence for the first time. She thought about the woman she had been 1 year ago in a kitchen on a marble floor. Blood on her lip, hands pressed to this child who had not yet arrived, calling a number memorized at 7 years old and setting the rest of her life in motion. "I'm good, Papa," she said. "I'm really good." Her daughter made a sound. Small and impatient, the sound of someone who has opinions already, someone who is not going to be managed or minimized or made to feel smaller than she is. Kate looked at her and felt with a certainty she had never felt about anything in the years of careful survival that had brought her here, that this child was going to be all right, that she was going to grow up in a house without locked bathrooms and hidden boxes and the low constant vibration of fear. That she was going to know from the very beginning what her mother had taken 30 years to learn. That safety is not something you earn from the people who are supposed to love you. It is something you build yourself on ground you choose in a life that is entirely and completely yours. Kate Sterling had walked into a marriage with a name that wasn't hers and walked out of it as Katia Volkova, a woman who had been broken and hidden and struck to the ground and who had gotten up every time. Who had kept a box of evidence in a closet for 2 years, who had memorized an emergency number at age 7 and used it at age 29, who had sat in a courtroom with a bruise on her face and told the truth until it became the only version of events that mattered. She had not merely survived. She had arrived and in a room that smelled like antiseptic and new, beginning with her daughter on her chest and her father's voice in her ear and her whole life arranged in front of her. Like a door finally opened, Kate held on and did not let go.